Is seeing really believing? What happens when our senses disagree? We know about the world because we have senses: sight, sound, touch, taste, smell, balance, movement, body state. Our senses are the messengers. This seems obvious. Most of the time, our senses work in harmony. Our eyes see a ball bounce, and our ears hear the thud at almost the same moment. But not always. Sometimes our senses fall out of sync. The messages don't line up. And when that happens, prediction doesn't go quite the way we expected. So, what happens when what we see doesn't match what we hear, or when the brain starts ignoring input from one sense in favor of another, or when an entire sensory channel goes offline? This essay starts a new series about how our brains use different senses to verify reality, or good enough reality, and what happens when those inputs don't go as planned. As usual, throughout this series, we'll also consider how biological brains compare to the way machines work, and whether those differences are the kind of differences that matter. This week, we're starting with vision. For most of us, vision is the sense we tend to trust the most. Intuitively, vision feels direct, like we have a live feed from the outside world. So, what happens when we mess with our most trusted sense? To find out, let's try to answer 3 questions. 1. What happens when we change the input our eyes get? 2. What happens if that change lasts for days? And 3. What can these strange experiments tell us about how perception really works? Question 1. What happens when we change the input our eyes get? You might remember this from high school biology. The image projected onto your retina is upside down. And yet, somehow, we don't see the world that way. Maybe your teacher explained it by saying the brain flips the image. That's a nice story, but that story isn't quite right. We'll come back to this point in a bit, but first, I want to look at what happens when we deliberately invert the input that hits our retina. Imagine waking up one morning and putting on a pair of inverting goggles. These strange-looking things flip the entire visual field upside down. Imagine how disorientating this would be. Imagine trying to navigate the world if the sky was down and the ground was up. Strange as it sounds, that's exactly what volunteers did in a series of classic experiments. These weren't quick lab sessions either. The goggles stayed on for days, sometimes weeks, and in a few rare cases, even months. Imagine that. Imagine reaching for your coffee pot, but your coffee pot was upside down and somewhere near the ceiling, which looked like the floor. If you reach up, you see your hand move down, away from the pot. If you reach down, away from where the pot appears, your hand moves towards it. Your eyes and your body are no longer in agreement. Things would get especially weird when we tried to pour ourselves a cup of coffee. Imagine what you would see. According to what you see, gravity works backwards. Liquids fall up. But of course, gravity hasn't actually changed at all. Yesterday, your vision was your most reliable sense, but today, wearing these goggles, it has become your least reliable one. Your other senses that tell you about up and down, your balance, touch, and proprioception, and sound, are all telling you the world is as it always has been, upright. But your vision, well, it disagrees. Question 2. So what happens when you wear these inverting goggles for days? At first, as you might guess, it was chaos for these volunteers. They stumbled around, missed door handles, tripped over themselves, and poured coffee on the floor. Activities like riding a bike or climbing stairs were absurdly difficult. But readers of this newsletter will probably not be surprised to learn that this chaos did not last. The brain, as we know, is very good at adapting. In those early 1950 studies, it took just 5 to 6 days of wearing goggles before volunteers said the world looked normal again. It no longer seemed upside down. That alone is remarkable. The brain seemed to completely adapt to input that had been flipped on its head in just under a week. But what's more interesting is how the volunteers said this change happened. They didn't just wake up one day and suddenly see the world the right way up. The shift, they reported, was gradual. And not only gradual, but strangely selective. Certain objects seemed to flip before other objects, as if the brain were recalibrating its sense of uprightness piece by piece. With vision no longer lining up with the other senses, the brain had to relearn the link between movement and sight. It could have relied on head movement, eye movement, sound, or gravity to relearn what up meant. For example, moving the head down used to reveal more of the floor. But with the goggles on, moving the head down suddenly showed more of the ceiling. Out of all of the strategies the brain might have tried, one strategy stood out: touch. By around day 3, something strange began to happen. When the volunteers reached out and touched an object, traced its edges and felt its contours, the volunteers reported that the object they were touching, and only that object, suddenly seemed right side up. The volunteers claimed that objects they were interacting with looked upright, while the rest of the world remained upside down. Imagine how strange that must have been. Using their hands seemed to make all the difference too, because volunteers who were instructed not to move around or interact with their environment adapted much more slowly, and some never adapted at all. So what happened when these volunteers finally took off the goggles? Well, they saw the world upside down. This after effect didn't last long though. In some cases, it was just a few minutes, and the world seemed upright again. Question 3. What can we learn from these strange old experiments? At first glance, the inverted goggle studies might seem like little more than a quirky story, some old thing a scientist tried a long time ago. Interesting, sure, but not much more than that. But how we interpret the results from these experiments raise deeper philosophical questions. Some take these findings as evidence that perception requires action, that we learn to see the world correctly, not just by looking, but by doing. Others interpret the data quite differently. To them, perception is a representation of the outside world, and if you give the brain enough time, it will recalibrate and flip the internal representation back to how it's supposed to be. As odd as these experiments are, how to interpret their findings is still up for debate. Take a more recent study where volunteers wore inverting goggles for 10 days. Just like the earlier research, they adapted surprisingly well. Within a few days, they were walking through town, shopping for groceries, even skiing down a slope, as if nothing were out of the ordinary. Watching them, you'd assume their brains had quickly adjusted. And if adaptation was simply a matter of flipping an internal representation, you might expect to see that flip reflected somewhere in the brain's visual maps. When we talk about visual maps, we're usually referring to early visual areas like V1. These regions are retinotopically organized, which just means that every point of light that hits the retina has a matching point in V1. In other words, the brain preserves the layout of the retina. So, if the brain truly flipped the representation from upside down to right side up, we might expect to see that flip reflected in this map. A reversal in perception should show up in a reversal in the brain's representation. But that's not what the brain scans showed. Activity in primary visual cortex remained unchanged. There was no flip in the map, no rewiring of the visual coordinates. Some have taken this as evidence that the brain does not flip a representation, and others say this is because There is no representation to flip. But the story is more complicated than that. Because while volunteers in the original studies claimed the world eventually looked upright, participants in more recent experiments reported that this wasn't their experience. Even though they were able to function normally, walk through town, ride bikes, even ski down slopes, they didn't say the world had flipped upright. They said it remained upside down. So, what is going on? To start unpacking that, let's imagine vision were your only sense. You had no hearing, no balance, no sense of touch, no proprioception, no sense of gravity. You just had visual input. Now suppose you put on goggles that flipped your visual field upside down. Could you say your vision had been inverted? Probably not. Without other senses to compare against, there's no baseline, no up or down to refer to. Inversion only makes sense if there's something else to anchor it to. The same goes if all your senses were inverted at once. If everything flipped, sight, balance, proprioception, how would you ever notice? What would you compare your experience to? The volunteers in the prism goggle studies weren't in this situation. They had other senses to rely on: balance, movement, and sense of gravity. And they had something else too: memory. They remembered what the world looked like before the flip. Those extra anchors gave them something to recalibrate against. Neuroscientists call this multisensory calibration, and we do it constantly. When we watch a basketball game, for example, our brain syncs sight and sound to follow the ball. But light and sound travel at different speeds. They hit your brain on different timelines. But we don't experience the sound after we see the ball hit the ground. The brain calibrates. This is why when sight and sound are slightly out of sync, like in dubbed movies, the brain can recalibrate to reduce the mismatch. But this can sound like there's a little theatre in the head, and we know there's no such theatre in your head. Plus, scans showed that even after days of wearing inversion goggles, the visual cortex doesn't flip its map. So, what exactly is being recalibrated when the brain recalibrates? One idea is that the brain is recalibrating the relationship between signals. Your brain is constantly predicting inputs and comparing those predictions to what it actually gets from multiple senses: vision, balance, touch, and proprioception. When volunteers first put on the inverting goggles, the brain's predictions are very wrong. The relationship between input from your eyes and input from other senses, like the inner ear and the hands, are entirely opposite of what the brain predicts. The brain's expectations about the relationship needs updating. So it gets to work, not flipping a representation, but rebuilding the relationship between inputs. Touch becomes a powerful ally. When you reach out and feel the shape of an object, your brain uses that input as solid, dependable feedback. It grounds reality in what you feel and learns the new relationship. But of course, prediction doesn't answer all the questions we might want to ask about perception. We might still wonder what allows the volunteers to say the world seems upright or inverted. Many think we're still left with that tricky question. What exactly is perception? So, how do you think we answer that question? Thank you so much for listening to this essay. I just want to take a small moment to say a huge thank you and a note on some changes at When Life Gives You a Brain. When I started this little newsletter around 18 months ago, I did so mostly because I love writing and I love thinking about the intersection of neuroscience, philosophy of mind, and artificial intelligence. And I saw this as a way to explore that intersection more deeply. But I also was quietly hoping that by writing, I might find others who are just as curious about these questions as I am. And I have. We found each other. This community has become one of the most rewarding parts of my life. Your comments, your questions, and perspectives, they challenge me and they teach me. And quite often, they send what I think are the ideas in new directions that I hadn't considered. That conversation, this conversation, is the reason I keep writing. So I want to take the time to say thank you. Truly, thank you. But one of the things I didn't seem to anticipate was just how limited time can be. I don't write this newsletter full time. I also run a company. So the writing and the replying happen in the margins. They happen early in the mornings, in the late evenings, and in the little gaps in the day. And as many of you have noticed, sometimes my replies are late, or despite my best efforts, they slip through the cracks entirely. Until now, I've been prioritizing the writing, and I've been squeezing in comments when I can. But from now on, I want to try to flip that. So moving forward, the essays might come a little less predictably. It's a trade-off, I know. But of all the trade-offs, I think this is the better one. The comments are where so many of the best ideas are being discussed. So I'm going to try this. If it turns out terribly, I'll just try something else. And thanks again for being here. I really mean that more than you know.